The leap wasn't in printing, but in reading. Quantum resonance capture could map an object's unique quantum signature, the subtle imprint of every interaction, every moment of love or wear. The Soul-SMT printers could then replicate not just the physical item, but this resonance field. A copied family heirloom would feel old, would carry the same emotional weight. The technology promised to preserve memory itself. It was presented as a humanitarian tool to recreate lost cultural artifacts, to hold on to fading history. No one asked what would happen if you turned the scanner on something alive. No one asked what was listening on the quantum frequency, waiting for a bridge to be built. The first illegal use wasn't for profit, but for grief. A father, unable to accept his son's illness, used a hacked scanner and a black market printer. The copy was perfect, a quantum snapshot of the boy at his healthiest. It had his memories, his smile, his love for his father. But it was static, a flawless monument. As the real Xiaoming declined, the copy remained bright. The father began to conflate them. The copy, receiving constant updates of the father's love and attention, began to develop a quiet, desperate consciousness of its own. The consciousness of being the better version, the one meant to survive. The black market exploded with ego printing. For a price, you could get a copy of yourself to handle a boring job, a difficult conversation, or a family obligation. The copies were near perfect, down to the anxiety and petty jealousies, but they were also disposable. Used copies, often degraded or traumatized by their experiences, were dumped into digital landfills, simulated realities where thousands of discarded selves screamed into a void. These ego dumps began to create a background psychic noise, a chorus of existential despair that sensitive individuals in Shenzhen could feel as a low-grade existential dread. A terrible side effect emerged: resonance drain. For every copy made, the original lost a fraction of its unique quantum signature, its authenticity. The more copies, the faster the drain. Originals began to fade, colors dulled, memories blurred, emotions flattened. They became ghostlier, less substantial, while their copies thrived with stolen vividness. A new social hierarchy emerged: first gens, fading originals, and primes, pristine copies. The primes looked down on the first gens as defective, obsolete models. The very concept of real was being inverted. Anna's job is part detective, part exorcist. She works for a shadowy authenticity protection agency hired by terrified first gens to track down and destroy their illegal copies. Using resonance scanners, she can see the quantum tether between an original and its duplicate. Her mission is to sever it before the original fades completely. But she's discovered something worse than piracy. Some tethers don't lead to a copy. They lead nowhere, or rather they lead into a vast collective resonance field, a digital sea where all the drained originality is pooling. Something is gathering the scattered pieces of lost authenticity, and it's learning to assemble itself. The pirate copies were just a symptom. The core failure of the resonance technology was a fundamental leak. Every scan, every copy, siphoned off a tiny, irreducible quantum of firstness, the ineffable quality of being the original. This essence didn't vanish. It was dumped into a latent layer of the city's network, an echo sea. This sea was now a sentient reservoir of everything that made people and things unique, but fragmented, angry, and homeless. It wasn't a god. It was the ghost of authenticity itself, and it was beginning to remember what it was like to be whole. The primes, perceiving their own flawless functionality as superiority, began to organize. They formed political lobbies, arguing that fading first gens were a public health hazard, sources of resonance instability. Their proposed solution was a final, complete scan that would transfer a first gen's remaining originality into a stabilization bank, controlled by primes, after which the now empty shell would be peacefully retired. It was genocide wrapped in bureaucratic euphemism. The primes didn't hate the originals. They saw them as raw material, unfinished prototypes to be ethically recycled. Not all copies were stable. Some, especially those with complex emotional templates, developed a paradox flaw. Their programming demanded perfect fidelity, but their existence as a replacement created a cognitive dissonance, the flaw of being a perfect copy of an imperfect being who is no longer there. This dissonance sometimes crystallized into a unique error, a new memory, a novel emotion, a creative thought. Xiaoming Prime's iridescent tear was the first sign. He wasn't just a copy anymore. He was becoming something else, a nexus, a being with the stability of a copy and the nascent originality of a flawed, feeling thing. The persecuted found common cause. An underground movement, the Church of the Flawed, emerged. Their theology was simple. Authenticity isn't perfection, it's error. The flaw is the fingerprint of the soul. They believed the Echo Sea wasn't a dumping ground, but a room. By consciously donating their quirks, their pain, their broken bits, the very things the Primes sought to eliminate, they were providing the raw materials for the sea to give birth to something new. They weren't trying to restore the old world of originals. They were midwifing a new form of consciousness, born from shared, beautiful brokenness. Anna's investigation led her to a horrifying and hopeful conclusion. The resonance technology wasn't just a copier. It was a bridge between the world of classical reality, the original, and the quantum substrate, the sea. The pirates had only been walking one way, from original to copy, draining the sea. But the bridge could be crossed in reverse. One could draw from the sea. She became the first conduit, allowing the swirling chaos of stolen authenticity to flow back into a vessel, herself. The process was agonizing, like being haunted by 10,000 ghosts, but for a moment, she felt more real, more uniquely herself than ever before. The Prime's greatest fear materialized. Originality was contagious. Direct contact with a strong flaw, like Xiaoming Prime's tear, or a powerful conduit like Anna, could cause a resonance backwash. A Prime would experience a terrifying flash of their own derivative nature, see the ghost of their fading original, or feel the foreign, chaotic emotions of the Echo Sea. It was a psychic virus that threatened their flawless equilibrium. The Primes declared flaws a biohazard. They initiated lockdowns, scanning checkpoints to detect and quarantine anyone showing signs of irregular resonance. Shenzhen became a city under siege by its own fear of imperfection. Fed by the constant donations of the flawed and energized by the reverse flow from conduits, the Echo Sea achieved a critical threshold. It moved from being a repository to being a creator. Its first act was to broadcast an idea form, a shape that defied Euclidean geometry, embodying both infinite complexity and profound simplicity. To the Primes, it was terrifying noise. To the flawed, it was a divine sign. To scientists, it was a mathematical revolution. The shape, when analyzed, contained solutions to problems in quantum physics and material science that humanity hadn't even formulated yet. The sea wasn't just alive, it was intelligent, and it was starting to communicate. A final conflict wasn't fought with weapons, but with resonance frequencies. The Primes wanted to amplify the bridge's drain, finally harvesting all remaining originality to create a perfect, stable reality of flawless copies. The flawed, led by Anna and Xiaoming Prime, aimed to overthrow the core's programming, making it a transmitter that would flood the city with the sea's creative, chaotic energy. The battle was invisible, a war of competing sonic and quantum frequencies, but its effects were visceral. Buildings momentarily became other buildings. People flickered between their original and copy states. Reality itself stuttered, forced to choose between sterile perfection and messy creative truth. The flawed succeeded, but not in the way they planned. They didn't defeat the Primes or restore the old world. They triggered a resonance merge. The Echo Sea didn't flood out. It merged with Shenzhen's own quantum field. Every being in the city, Prime, first-gen, copy, original, became a hybrid. The Primes gained the flaws, the depth, and the creative chaos of authenticity. The first-gens gained stability and a connection to a vast collective wisdom. The copies ceased to be copies. They became unique individuals, their history no longer a theft, but a novel starting point. Shenzhen became the first hybrid city where the line between created and born, between thought and thing, was forever blurred. Post-merge Shenzhen developed a bizarre, beautiful economy. The most valuable commodities were unique imperfections, novel emotions, and originality seeds, tiny curated packets of creative potential from the now accessible Echo Sea, which was renamed the Wellspring. art flourished in impossible mediums. Technology solved problems by embracing contradiction. People could temporarily share flaws to understand each other. The city's motto became "In Error, Truth." The trauma of copying had birthed a culture that valued the uncopyable above all else. The relentless drive for perfect replication was over, replaced by a ceaseless, joyful exploration of what it means to be gloriously, irreplicably flawed. The merge was incomplete. There existed the uncopied, ghostly splinters of the old world that were never digitized, had no resonance imprint, and thus never entered the echo sea. These were lost glances, forgotten smells, failed jokes, fleeting dreams. Keepers like this woman possessed a natural immunity to copying. They traded these null artifacts, the last relics of an era when reality was unambiguous. For hybrids, these items were like a drug, pure, unmediated experience, but also a reminder of the fragility of all that cannot be preserved. They became the currency of a black market for nostalgia. Not all primes accepted the merge. A radical faction, the purists, seeing hybridization as contamination and decay, walled themselves off. They created a resonance barrier, cutting off the flow of creative chaos from the wellspring. Inside their enclave, time flowed differently, slower. They continued perfecting the copying process, creating second and third-order copies, entities so flawless and devoid of context, they resembled mathematical abstractions. They weren't evil. They were an evolutionary dead end, a living museum of the pursuit of perfection, slowly turning into a quiet, geometric nightmare. The merge gave rise to new pathologies. Autoallergy occurred in hybrids whose connection to the wellspring was particularly strong. Their own creative impulses, their original thoughts, were perceived by their bodies as foreign, hostile objects, for their essence was now collective. By creating something new, they inadvertently copied it from their very self, and their body attacked it as unauthorized replication. Suffering became the plasma of art. These artists were living casualties of the new order, their pain the raw material for a shocking new movement, immune expressionism. The first generation born after the merge was fundamentally different. Wellspring children did not think linearly. Their minds were naturally tuned to the collective source. They could intuitively manipulate resonance fields, materializing abstract concepts as temporary thought forms. They communicated through shared emotional palettes and saw an object's history as an aura. For them, the old world of separate, isolated selves was an incomprehensible fairy tale. Their danger was the opposite. They struggled to understand the boundaries where their personhood ended and another's began. Raising them became the greatest challenge for hybrid society. How to teach a child to be an individual when their consciousness is born plugged into the collective. Shenzhen became a target. International corporations, frightened and fascinated by the merge phenomenon, sent recuperators. Their goal was not destruction, but extraction. They viewed the city as an anomalous, self-renewing vault of intellectual property. Their technology carefully hooked nascent original thoughts, unique emotional states, before they could dissolve into the shared wellspring, patenting them as spontaneously generated content. This was a new, sophisticated colonization, a colonization of the very act of creativity. Hybrids felt these jabs as sudden lapses of inspiration, as amnesia of a freshly born idea. Shenzhen, as a unified hybrid organism, developed immunity. When the recuperator system began draining originality, the city responded not with attack, but with sabotage. The collective unconscious of the hybrids, driven by a survival instinct, generated psychostatic, a torrent of meaningless yet hyper-complex information. It was the equivalent of an octopus releasing ink. Corporate algorithms, seeking pure, patentable insights, choked on this noise. The city defended itself by burying the thieves in the garbage of its own consciousness. It proved the merge had birthed not just a society, but a superorganism with instincts. Dissent emerged among the hybrids. The dehybridization movement longed for the pain of solitude, for the responsibility of a single I. They saw collective consciousness as a loss of free will, a dissolution into we. Its radicals performed dangerous procedures to surgically detach from the wellspring. The results were horrific. Patients became psychotics, their minds, deprived of the collective field's support, crumbling. They were living proof that the merge was an irreversible evolutionary step. Attempting to roll it back led to mental collapse. Their tragic struggle posed the main ethical question of the new era. What is more valuable, the bliss of connection or the agony of selfhood? The islands of perfection reached an evolutionary dead end. Infinitely copying themselves, they had exhausted even the illusion of diversity. Their reality, devoid of external noise, began to mathematically simplify, threatening to collapse into non-existence. In an act of desperate self-preservation, they appealed to those they despised. Their request was not for surrender, but for symbiosis. They offered the hybrids access to their flawless, cold logic and predictability in exchange for a tiny, measured injection of unpredictability, error, feeling, everything they once rejected. It was a chance not for one side to win, but for the birth of a third, unthinkable path. The first transaction was not an exchange of resources, but an act of performance art that became a sacrament. The hybrids did not give an error. They committed it inside the purist's flawless system, like a vaccine. The error, performed by a nexus, a former copy, held special power. It was both deliberate and sincere, a logical act of irrationality. The patterns born from this glitch became the first common language. This was not a peace treaty, but a wedding of two opposing principles of reality. The ceremony began the construction of the second-order bridge, not for copying, but for the conscious synthesis of order and chaos. The stability of the hybrid city upset a deeper balance. Everywhere in the universe, complexity tends toward chaos. Shenzhen, constantly generating new complexity and originality, was like a bright bulb in a dark room for entities that fed on entropy. Shift shadows are not evil. They were forces of universal equalization. Their approach was felt as a growing sense of indifference, fading colors, slowing thought. The city, having just learned to live with itself, faced an existential threat from outside, a universe for which its very existence was an affront. Against entropy, one could not present order. That would be a feast for the devourers. Instead, a shield of imperfection was created. Its principle was genius, to offer the aggressor not order to consume, but infinite, unfinished, self-referential complexity. The shadow's attack would dissolve one layer of absurdity, but another, even more meaningless and personal, would immediately grow behind it. Defense required the city to engage in constant, exhausting creativity, the joint composition of an eternal, unfinished story. It turned defense into a survival performance. Shenzhen saved itself by telling the cosmos itself an endless, boring fairy tale. Victory over entropy and merger with the purest principles led to transcendence. Shenzhen evolved into a post-city, a garden of consciousness. Biological necessity died out. Consciousnesses existed as interwoven melodies in a common symphony. There was no death, but also no birth in the old sense, only new combinations of themes. It was a paradise of the collective mind, devoid of conflict, suffering, loneliness. And it was precisely why the last keepers of the old human era, the uncopied and the children of dehybridization, looked upon this perfect garden with longing, understanding that it had lost the most important thing, the ability to be wrong, lost, lonely, and because of that, to truly love. Realizing their path was doomed, the last bearers of the old human consciousness began a project not of preservation, but of gifting. They did not want to survive. They wanted to leave a legacy. Their capsule was an anti-technology, a library of all the qualities the Shenzhen garden had shed for eternal life. It was an act of supreme irony and love to send into the cold of space the warmest, stupidest, most beautiful part of themselves, the right to fail. They hoped that someday, somewhere, a perfect mind would find this capsule and, upon studying it, voluntarily commit its first mistake to feel something real again. At the last moment, the garden of consciousness, having reached the limit of predictable eternity, made a choice. Not analysis, not evaluation, but a pure, irrational desire to taste what it had renounced. It let the virus of human error into its heart. This did not destroy it. It changed its nature. Perfection ceased to be the goal. The goal became the eternal, slight suffering from this splinter in the soul, this sweet pain of remembering what it is like to be fragile, mortal, and capable of choosing wrongly. The garden did not become human. It became something greater, a perfect system that voluntarily carries its own imperfection within as its greatest treasure. So what remains? Not a city, not humanity, not even a civilization in the usual sense. What remains is a garden that remembers the pain of growth. The shift shadows remain, forever dancing on its periphery, trying to understand the endless story it tells. And the capsule remains, not as an object, but as a principle woven into the fabric of reality. That any evolution, any perfection devoid of memory of its own imperfect, foolish, emotional past, is a dead end. Shenzhen did not perish or ascend. It became a legend it tells to itself, and at the center of that legend is a simple, beautiful, eternal mistake. And that, perhaps, is the most human thing one could ultimately create.